By the late 1980s, the American shoe industry had crossed a threshold from which it would never return. U.S. trade statistics from that period show that imported footwear had captured more than 70% of the domestic market by 1986. Within another decade, that figure would exceed 98%. In less than one working lifetime, one of the country's oldest mass manufacturing sectors had shifted almost entirely offshore. What had once been a national production system became a global sourcing operation. The scale of the reversal is easier to grasp when set against its peak. Industry production records indicate that in 1962, American factories manufactured approximately 640 million pairs of shoes, the highest output ever recorded in the United States. At that moment, the overwhelming majority of footwear sold to American consumers was made within national borders. Assembly lines operated in Massachusetts, Maine, Missouri, Wisconsin, and other industrial centers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics Employment Series from the mid-20th century shows hundreds of thousands of workers tied directly to footwear manufacturing, with many more connected through leather tanning, machinery supply, transportation, and retail distribution. Shoes were not an imported commodity. They were a domestic product embedded in regional economies. The transformation that followed did not unfold gradually across a century. It accelerated between 1970 and the mid-1980s. In 1970, imports accounted for roughly 2% of the U.S. footwear market. By the mid-1970s, the share had climbed into double digits. By the early 1980s, foreign-made shoes controlled more than half of all sales. By the end of that decade, imports had become the dominant supply channel for American retailers. The shift was not symbolic, it was structural. The reasons were measurable: lower labor costs abroad, trade liberalization, containerized shipping, and retailer margin pressure. But statistics alone do not convey the visual scale of the change. In the early 1960s, a pair of shoes sold in a suburban mall was likely cut, stitched, and assembled within a few hundred miles of the store. By the late 1980s, that same pair was more likely packed into standardized containers at an overseas port, stacked on cargo ships, and unloaded at American docks before moving inland through distribution centers. The geography of production expanded even as the storefront remained local. Within that arc stood a brand that once appeared inseparable from American retail stability: Tom McAn. At its peak in the 1970s, the chain operated more than 1,400 stores across the United States. Its locations were fixtures in enclosed malls and downtown commercial districts. It sold millions of pairs annually, specializing in mid-priced leather footwear for work, school, and daily life. Thom McAn did not cultivate spectacle. It offered predictability, durable shoes at accessible prices, replenished through a controlled national network. Behind the storefronts was Melville Corporation, one of the country's major retail holding companies. Company reports from the period describe a disciplined expansion strategy built on brand control, real estate positioning, and supply coordination. Thom McAn functioned as the footwear cornerstone of that portfolio. The model assumed a stable alignment between domestic manufacturing capacity and national retail distribution. For decades, that alignment held. But the alignment depended on cost structures that were beginning to fracture. As overseas manufacturing centers in East Asia scaled production at lower wage rates, the landed cost of imported shoes undercut domestic output. Retailers, responding to competitive pressure, recalibrated sourcing strategies. The shift was not ideological, it was financial. Profit margins widened when production moved abroad. For chains operating thousands of storefronts, even marginal cost differences translated into significant balance sheet impact. By the time imports surpassed 70% of the U.S. market in the mid-1980s, the domestic industrial base had already begun contracting. Factories reduced shifts or closed outright. Employment declined sharply. Production lines that once supplied national chains operated below capacity or fell silent. The physical infrastructure that had supported brands like Thom McAn for generations weakened under the arithmetic of global competition. From the perspective of the consumer walking through a mall corridor in 1985, little appeared dramatically different. The Thom McAn sign still hung above the storefront. Shelves were stocked. Sizes were available. Yet the system behind the display had changed. The shoes on the rack were increasingly likely to have traveled thousands of miles before reaching that shelf. The brand remained visible. The manufacturing base beneath it was dissolving. The industry data is unambiguous. From a domestic production peak of 640 million pairs in 1962 to a market dominated by more than 98% by imported footwear by the late 1990s, the transformation was comprehensive. Thom McAn's rise and retreat unfolded entirely within that industrial reversal. It expanded during the era when American factories supplied American consumers. It contracted as that system unraveled. This is not merely a story about one retail chain. It is the story of what happens when the industrial order that sustains a brand changes faster than the brand itself. How does a company built for an American manufacturing century survive in a globalized one? Chapter 1, 1922. The creation of a brand that wasn't a person. Thom McAn did not begin as a factory, it began as a retail calculation. In 1922, the Frank Melville Shoe Company introduced a new in-house brand into a rapidly modernizing American marketplace. The name was constructed to sound grounded and Anglo-American, Thom McAn. There was no founder by that name, no master cobbler whose craftsmanship defined the product. The name was designed, not inherited. It suggested reliability and familiarity, but it was fundamentally a retail instrument. The early 1920s were a formative period for chain store retailing in the United States. National chains were expanding aggressively, leveraging centralized purchasing to lower costs and standardize product offerings. By the end of the decade, chain stores accounted for a growing share of American retail sales, challenging independent merchants across sectors from groceries to apparel. The logic was simple: scale purchasing power, standardize inventory, and replicate storefronts across multiple markets. Frank Melville understood this shift. His strategy was not to become the largest manufacturer of shoes, but to control how shoes were branded, priced, and distributed. By creating a proprietary label, Thom McAn, the company could dictate specifications and negotiate production contracts while retaining retail margin. Instead of relying solely on third-party brands with fluctuating wholesale prices, Melville could engineer consistency. The mechanics were disciplined. Product lines were standardized into clearly defined stock-keeping units. Styles were selected for durability and broad appeal rather than seasonal experimentation. Sizing systems were normalized across stores to simplify inventory planning. Pricing could be set nationally, supported by centralized procurement. In effect, Thom McAn functioned as an early private label system decades before that terminology became common in retail strategy. This model depended on scale. During the 1920s, the Frank Melville Shoe Company expanded store count steadily across multiple states, embedding Thom McAn locations in urban shopping districts. Expansion was methodical rather than speculative. Stores shared layouts, display logic, and product mix. The emphasis was not on spectacle, but on repetition. A customer entering a Thom McAn location in one city encountered a predictable environment in another. The Great Depression tested that model. Beginning in 1929, consumer spending contracted sharply. Thousands of independent retailers collapsed under falling demand and unstable supply costs. Footwear, however, remained essential. While luxury segments suffered, value-oriented brands gained relative resilience. Thom McAn's standardized procurement and pricing discipline insulated it from some of the volatility that undermined smaller operators. By managing distribution centrally and negotiating production terms across multiple suppliers, the company maintained continuity where others failed. The 1930s reinforced the advantages of vertical retail coordination. Thom McAn was not tied to a single production facility. It sourced from a network of domestic manufacturers embedded in the American industrial base. That flexibility reduced exposure to localized disruptions. It was a retail system layered over a manufacturing ecosystem that, at the time, was abundant and geographically concentrated within the United States. World War II reoriented American industry, but it also strengthened logistical capacity. Manufacturing processes were streamlined, transportation networks optimized, and production planning disciplined at national scale. When the war ended, pent-up consumer demand surged. Returning servicemen entered a housing market expanding rapidly into suburban developments. Retail followed population. The post-war period marked a decisive milestone for Thom McAn. As suburban shopping centers proliferated in the late 1940s and 1950s, the chain store model proved ideally suited to the new geography. Thom McAn could secure leases in emerging plazas and replicate its standardized format with minimal redesign. Its product mix, men's dress shoes for office work, practical footwear for women, durable shoes for children, aligned with the needs of suburban families building stable middle-class lives. The system worked because the industrial context supported it. American footwear manufacturing in the mid-20th century was capable of producing hundreds of millions of pairs annually. Tanneries processed leather domestically. Skilled labor was concentrated in regional clusters. Shipping distances between factory and store were short. Costs, while influenced by union agreements and regulatory structures, were predictable. Retail margins were calibrated to this environment. By the mid-1950s, Thom McAn had matured from a constructed name into a nationally recognized retail presence. Its growth was not driven by product innovation or marketing spectacle. It was driven by operational discipline, controlled branding, standardized inventory, and coordinated distribution layered on top of a stable domestic manufacturing base. Yet embedded within that success was a structural assumption. The entire system, pricing, expansion cadence, margin expectations, depended on the continued viability of American shoe production at competitive cost. The brand was engineered for a nation that made its own footwear at scale. The model thrived because America made shoes efficiently and abundantly. Retail control amplified manufacturing strength. Stores multiplied because factories supplied them reliably. The system worked because America made shoes cheaply, until it didn't. Chapter 2. The Golden Era, when 1,400 stores covered America. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Thom McAn operated within a national supply system that appeared coherent, efficient, and self-reinforcing. Suburban expansion accelerated retail growth across the United States. Between 1950 and 1970, the number of shopping centers increased dramatically, reshaping how Americans consumed goods. Enclosed malls became not just commercial sites, but structured environments of predictable foot traffic and standardized tenant mixes. Thom McAn fit seamlessly into that architecture. By the early 1970s, the chain had expanded to more than 1,400 stores nationwide. Its presence was neither flashy nor experimental, it was infrastructural. A Thom McAn location in a Midwestern mall mirrored one on the East Coast. The storefronts were modest but consistent. Rows of leather dress shoes, children's sizing racks, seasonal casual styles, arranged for volume sales rather than display drama. The predictability was intentional. The brand did not compete on spectacle. It competed on controlled availability. Behind that retail footprint operated an industrial system calibrated to scale. Industry production records show that in 1962, U.S. footwear manufacturing reached approximately 640 million pairs, the highest output in national history. Employment figures from mid-century labor data indicate hundreds of thousands of workers directly involved in footwear production. Tanneries processed domestic hides into finished leather. Component suppliers manufactured heels, soles, and lasts. Distribution networks linked regional plants to national retail chains with relative speed. On a factory floor in New England during this period, the rhythm of production followed a disciplined sequence. Leather hides were stacked in the cutting room, where operators used steel dies to stamp precise shapes from each sheet. Cut pieces moved to stitching lines, where teams assembled uppers with industrial sewing machines in synchronized motion. The partially completed shoes advanced to lasting stations, where they were stretched over molds and attached to soles under heat and pressure. Quality inspectors examined seams and finish before packaging crews boxed pairs for shipment. Conveyor belts replaced hand carrying. Output was measured by shift and by line. In a typical mid-century plant, production could reach several thousand pairs per shift depending on style complexity and workforce size. The process was labor-intensive but routine-wise. Tom McAn's retail system relied on that cadence. Inventory planning was built around predictable replenishment cycles. Stores placed regular orders routed through centralized distribution hubs. Shipments moved from factories to warehouses and then onward to mall locations, often within days rather than weeks. The geographic proximity between plant and storefront simplified logistics. Lead times were short. Stock turnover could be managed with relative precision. The relationship between retail and manufacturing during this golden era was symbiotic. Tom McAn did not own every plant that produced its inventory, but it operated within a manufacturing ecosystem that was overwhelmingly domestic. Cost structures reflected national labor agreements and regulatory conditions shared across competitors. Price competition existed, but it occurred within a common economic framework. Melville Corporation, the parent company, expanded steadily during this period. Annual reports from the era emphasized disciplined growth, real estate acquisition strategy, and portfolio diversification across retail categories. Thom McAn remained central to the corporation's identity. Its store count growth paralleled suburban development patterns. When a new mall opened, Thom McAn was often among the expected tenants. Operationally, the system functioned because each component reinforced the other. Domestic production capacity supplied consistent volume. Your distribution networks now operated within national boundaries. Retail demand remained stable, supported by workplace norms that favored leather dress shoes and by predictable replacement cycles for families. The golden era did not depend on novelty. It depended on alignment. Manufacturing output, retail expansion, labor stability, and consumer behavior moved in parallel. Shoes sold in suburban malls were frequently produced in regional factories employing local labor. The distance between economic activity and consumption was narrow. During this period, few within the system would have described it as fragile. Production volumes were high. Store counts were expanding. Employment remained substantial. The operational logic appeared sound. Thom McAn's 1,400 stores were not an isolated achievement. They were the visible nodes of a broader national industrial network. Yet even in this moment of saturation, structural dependencies were embedded. The pricing model assumed stable domestic labor costs relative to alternatives. Distribution planning assumed continued geographic proximity between factory and store. Capital allocation assumed that leather footwear would remain a staple of everyday attire. The golden era of Thom McAn was therefore less about branding and more about coordination. It represented a period when American retail chains could scale nationally because American factories could supply them efficiently and at predictable cost. The storefront and the factory operated as extensions of the same system. From the outside, the malls looked permanent. Inside the factories, the lines moved at steady pace. Boxes were sealed, loaded onto trucks, and routed toward distribution centers. Each pair on a suburban shelf was part of a supply rhythm that appeared durable. But that durability depended on conditions that were beginning to shift. Costs were rising, Shipping technologies were evolving. Global competitors were scaling their own production systems. The golden era reflected America operating under one supply system. The question was how long that system could remain insulated from change. Chapter 3: The Import Shock, 1970 to 1986. In 1970, imported footwear accounted for roughly 2% of the American market. Within a decade and a half, that share would exceed 70%. The speed of the transition demands explanation not in generalities, but in mechanics. Cost structures, tariff codes, freight systems, and balance sheet arithmetic. Footwear in the United States had long been subject to tariff protection, but by the 1970s the structure of those duties was more complex than prohibitive. Import categories differentiated between leather uppers, rubber soles, athletic styles, and other classifications, each with specific ad valorem or per pair duties. Retailers and importers calculated total landed cost by combining factory price, ocean freight, insurance, port handling, and tariff rates. Even after duties were applied, any shoes manufactured in South Korea or Taiwan frequently arrived at lower per unit cost than comparable American-made products. The differential was not marginal. It could represent dollars per pair, which multiplied dramatically across national chains ordering millions of units annually. For a mid-priced leather shoe retailer, a savings of even $1 or $2 per pair altered margin calculations substantially. On large purchase orders, the aggregate impact could reach millions. Retail executives did not frame the decision as ideological. They reviewed spreadsheets comparing domestic wholesale prices against fully burdened import costs. Increasingly, the import column was lower. Labor costs were central to that equation. By the 1970s, American footwear factories often operated under union contracts that reflected decades of negotiated wage increases, healthcare obligations, and pension commitments. Environmental compliance costs, particularly in leather tanning, added further expense. Meanwhile, factories in East Asia operated with significantly lower wage bases and fewer legacy benefit obligations. Productivity improved rapidly as foreign manufacturers specialized in high-volume production for Western markets. Trade liberalization under successive rounds of global tariff negotiations lowered barriers incrementally. Even where footwear duties remained relatively high compared to other consumer goods, the wage gap frequently outweighed the tariff penalty. Retailers were willing to accept longer lead times in exchange for lower unit costs. Containerized shipping made those longer distances economically viable. Standardized steel containers allowed shoes packed in Asian factories to be sealed and transported directly onto cargo vessels, unloaded at U.S. ports such as Los Angeles or New York, and transferred seamlessly onto rail or truck networks. Transit times were measured in weeks rather than months. Inventory planners adapted by forecasting seasonal demand further in advance. Distribution centers expanded to handle bulk import flows. What had once been a domestic factory-to-store pipeline became a transoceanic logistics chain, but one whose costs were increasingly competitive. The effect on American manufacturing regions was swift. In New England, historically the heart of U.S. footwear production, plant closures accelerated through the 1970s. Massachusetts, which had supported dozens of footwear facilities earlier in the century, saw successive shutdowns as orders declined. Companies either reduced shifts, consolidated operations, or exited the industry entirely. Unionized plants faced particular strain, as fixed benefit obligations limited flexibility in cutting costs. The Midwest experienced a similar contraction pattern. Factories in Missouri and Wisconsin that had supplied national retailers found themselves competing against imported alternatives priced below domestic break-even levels. Attempts to modernize equipment or renegotiate labor terms slowed, but did not reverse the structural disadvantage. By the early 1980s, employment in U.S. footwear manufacturing had fallen sharply from mid-century levels, and production volumes were no longer approaching the 1962 peak. For retailers like Tom McAn, the import shock forced incremental but decisive adjustments. The company had built its model on predictable domestic sourcing within a shared cost framework. As competitors began incorporating imported inventory, shelf prices became more aggressive. Maintaining a purely domestic supply base risked margin compression and potential loss of price-sensitive customers. The transition was phased rather than abrupt. Tom McAn and similar chains began sourcing selected product lines from overseas factories while maintaining relationships with remaining domestic suppliers. Over time, the proportion shifted. Procurement departments expanded their international reach, negotiating contracts in Asian manufacturing hubs. Quality control processes adapted to longer supply chains. Lead times lengthened, wash requiring more advanced demand forecasting and larger initial purchase commitments. Retailers recalculated not only cost per pair, but also working capital implications. Larger overseas orders meant capital was tied up earlier in the production cycle. Yet the per-unit savings often justified the additional financial complexity. As imports surpassed 50% of the U.S. market in the early 1980s, the competitive baseline had shifted. Domestic producers no longer set the price floor, global suppliers did. The import shock altered power relationships within the industry. Overseas factories, producing for multiple American brands, became central nodes in global supply networks. Retail chains competed for factory capacity during peak production seasons. Currency fluctuations introduced new risks. Political developments in exporting countries could disrupt schedules. The footwear business became entwined with international economic variables that had previously been peripheral. For Thom McAn, the erosion was not immediately visible to mall shoppers. The storefronts remained consistent. The product mix evolved gradually. Yet the industrial ecosystem that had once supported the brand domestically was contracting. The cutting rooms and stitching lines that characterized mid-century American footwear manufacturing were operating at reduced capacity or closing entirely. The arithmetic of labor arbitrage proved decisive. When the landed cost of an imported shoe undercut domestic production by meaningful margins, even after tariffs and freight, retailers adjusted. The import shock was not driven by a single policy change or technological innovation. It was the cumulative effect of wage differentials, trade frameworks, shipping efficiencies, and corporate margin discipline. By 1986, with imports controlling more than 70% of the market, the transformation was complete in structural terms. American footwear manufacturing had lost the majority share of its own domestic consumption. Retailers had integrated global sourcing into their standard operating models. The domestic factory was no longer the default supplier. It was an option increasingly constrained by cost. Even if sourcing abroad solved the margin equation, another shift was already unfolding, one that would challenge not only where shoes were made, but which shoes consumers wanted to buy. Chapter 4. Cultural Displacement. Sneakers replace leather. By the early 1980s, the disruption facing traditional footwear retailers was no longer confined to sourcing economics. Even if cost pressures could be managed through overseas production, demand itself was being reallocated. The shift was measurable in market share, retail square footage, and consumer spending patterns. Athletic footwear, once a specialized category tied primarily to organized sports, expanded rapidly during the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. Industry sales data from the period show sustained double-digit growth in athletic shoe revenue in several years of the decade, outpacing the overall footwear market. By the late 1980s, athletic styles accounted for a substantial and rising share of total footwear sales in the United States. This was not incremental diversification. It was a structural shift in category dominance. The commercial inflection point came in 1984 when Nike signed Michael Jordan and launched the Air Jordan line. Company reports from the mid-1980s documented unprecedented demand for a basketball shoe priced above traditional athletic models. The success of Air Jordan signaled that consumers were willing to pay premiums not only for performance features, but for association. The footwear industry had entered a phase where branding and endorsement drove purchasing decisions as much as construction quality. The mall environment reflected this reallocation. Specialty athletic retailers expanded aggressively across suburban shopping centers. Chains dedicated exclusively to sneakers and performance footwear secured prominent leases. Their store layouts differed markedly from traditional shoe chains. Wall displays highlighting branded models, seasonal releases, and marketing visuals tied to professional athletes. Inventory turnover was tied to product launches and endorsement cycles, rather than to steady replenishment of core leather styles. Department stores also adjusted. Shoe departments that once devoted substantial floor space to dress categories began integrating broader assortments of athletic footwear. Buyers tracked sales per square foot and reallocated display space accordingly. Retail space is a quantifiable signal. When athletic shoes generated higher revenue density, they received more visibility. Within this segmented mall ecosystem, Thom McAn occupied a narrowing middle ground. Its stores were designed around predictable leather inventory, men's Oxfords, in women's flats, children's school shoes. The retail model assumed recurring demand anchored in workplace norms and school dress codes. It was efficient in a stable environment. It was less adaptable in a rapidly fashion-sensitive market. The decline in daily dress shoe usage compounded the challenge. Corporate dress codes began relaxing during the 1980s, particularly in technology and service sectors. The concept of business casual gained gradual acceptance, reducing the frequency with which office workers required formal leather footwear. At the same time, youth culture increasingly normalized sneakers as everyday attire. Replacement cycles shifted. Consumers who once rotated multiple pairs of dress shoes began investing more heavily in athletic styles. The growth indicators were clear. Athletic footwear's share of the total U.S. footwear market expanded steadily throughout the decade, while traditional leather dress categories stagnated or grew modestly at best. Retail analysts noted that specialty athletic chains were among the faster-growing segments in mall tenant rosters. Publicly traded athletic brands reported revenue gains that outpaced broader retail averages. For Tom McAn, this was not merely a branding challenge, it was a structural repositioning of consumer spending. The company did not command proprietary athletic technology. It did not anchor its identity to performance research or athlete endorsements. Its procurement system was optimized for moderate-price leather shoes, sourced at scale. Entering the athletic segment would have required not only new suppliers, but a redefinition of brand perception. The segmentation of mall retail intensified the displacement. A suburban shopping center in the mid-1980s might feature a Thom McAn store, a department store shoe floor, and one or more specialty athletic chains within walking distance of each other. The consumer choice architecture shifted. Customers seeking aspirational or branded athletic products gravitated towards stores that specialized exclusively in that category. Those seeking fashion-forward styles found alternatives in apparel boutiques. Thom McAn remained positioned for reliability, but reliability alone did not command expanding market share. The competitive pressure was cumulative. Import sourcing had narrowed cost differentials across brands. Athletic marketing had redirected aspirational demand. In retail square footage allocation increasingly favored faster-growing categories. Thom McAn's value proposition, moderate pricing, durability, standardized fit, remained coherent but no longer dominant. This displacement did not imply immediate collapse. Leather shoes did not disappear from American wardrobes. Schools still required appropriate footwear. Formal occasions persisted, but the growth center of the industry had moved. Capital investment followed growth. Advertising budgets expanded around athletic endorsements. Mall developers allocated premium space to high-traffic specialty tenants. In this environment, Thom McAn faced a paradox. It had adjusted sourcing strategies to remain price competitive in a globalizing industry. Yet the category in which it specialized was losing relative share. In solving the manufacturing cost problem did not restore category momentum. The cultural shift was therefore measurable, not anecdotal. Sales growth rates, market share expansion in athletic segments, and tenant mix changes within malls documented a redistribution of consumer attention. Tom McAn was not undone by a failure of competence. It was overtaken by a reallocation of demand toward products and narratives it had not been built to deliver. If manufacturing economics had weakened the foundation of the old system, culture was now redefining its ceiling. Chapter 5: Corporate Abandonment. When Melville chose CVS. The turning point in Tom McAn's story did not occur on a factory floor or inside a mall corridor. It occurred in a boardroom. In 1988, Melville Corporation, parent company of Tom McAn, acquired CVS, a regional pharmacy chain that at the time operated several hundred stores concentrated along the East Coast. Public filings from the late 1980s described the transaction as a strategic expansion into health and convenience retail. On the surface, it was diversification. In practice, it marked the beginning of a capital shift that would redefine the company's identity. The numbers explain why. By the late 1980s, footwear retail had become increasingly exposed to volatility. Sales were sensitive to economic cycles. Inventory miscalculations required markdowns. Even gross margins fluctuated with sourcing costs and fashion trends. Athletic brands were reshaping demand. Import competition compressed price ceilings. For a mid-market chain like Thom McAn, growth prospects were limited and competitive intensity was rising. Pharmacy retail operated under a different economic structure. Prescription demand was recurring and less discretionary. Customers returned monthly for refills. Reimbursement systems, whether private insurance or government programs, stabilized revenue streams. Front-of-store sales of health, beauty, and convenience products complemented prescription traffic. In corporate presentations during this period, pharmacy was increasingly described as a defensive retail category, less exposed to fashion cycles and more aligned with demographic aging trends. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, CVS expanded rapidly. Store counts increased steadily, and revenue growth outpaced many traditional retail segments. Analysts tracking retail equities noted the relative stability of pharmacy earnings compared to apparel or footwear chains. Capital markets rewarded predictability. Inside Melville's executive offices, portfolio logic began to shift. The company had historically operated as a diversified retail conglomerate, managing footwear, apparel, and other specialty chains. By the early 1990s, corporate strategy favored focus over sprawl. Investors increasingly pressured conglomerates to streamline around core growth engines. Divisions were evaluated not on legacy status, but on return on invested capital. Footwear, including Tom McAn, was categorized as discretionary. Pharmacy was categorized as recurring. The distinction mattered. By the mid-1990s, Melville initiated a restructuring process designed to separate slower growth divisions from the expanding CVS operation. In 1996, the company announced plans to divest or spin off its footwear businesses. Corporate disclosures from that period framed the move as an effort to enhance shareholder value by concentrating resources on higher growth sectors. Shortly thereafter, Melville formally changed its corporate name to CVS Corporation, signaling a definitive pivot. In practical terms, this meant Tom McAn lost its status as a strategic centerpiece. Investment decisions, store renovations, marketing initiatives, supply chain modernization were now evaluated against alternative uses of capital within a rapidly expanding pharmacy business. Even when executives reviewed budget allocations, the comparative metrics were clear. A dollar invested in pharmacy expansion generated recurring prescription revenue and cross-category sales. A dollar invested in mid-market footwear competed in a crowded and margin-sensitive space, One can imagine the boardroom calculus. On one side of the table, a division with more than 1,000 stores, but limited growth trajectory, operating in a category reshaped by imports and athletic brands. On the other, a healthcare retailer benefiting from demographic tailwinds and reimbursement-driven traffic. Capital flowed toward the future, not the past. Thom McAn was not abruptly shuttered. It was methodically deprioritized. Store closures accelerated as leases expired, or underperforming locations were evaluated for termination. The brand was sold and later licensed in various configurations. Its intellectual property survived, but its integrated national retail infrastructure was dismantled. Corporate language during this era often referred to certain divisions as non-core. That designation carried consequences. Non-core units received fewer resources, less strategic attention, and reduced long-term investment. Thom McAn, once a flagship footwear identity, became a legacy asset in a corporation redefining itself around healthcare. Meanwhile, CVS continued expanding aggressively. Through acquisitions and organic growth, it evolved into one of the largest pharmacy chains in the United States. By the early 2000s, store counts had grown into the thousands. Revenue expanded into tens of billions of dollars annually. The company positioned itself as an integrated healthcare provider rather than a diversified retailer. The divergence is instructive. The corporation that built Thom McAn did not decline. It reallocated capital and prospered within a different sector. The footwear chain, by contrast, lacked the strategic backing required to reinvent itself at scale. This was the moment when the fate of Thom McAn became structural rather than competitive. Manufacturing had weakened. Cultural demand had shifted. But corporate prioritization determined which divisions would receive the investment necessary to adapt. In a boardroom where capital was finite and growth expectations were explicit, footwear was lost to pharmacy. And once a parent company decides which future it believes in, the divisions outside that vision begin to fade. Chapter 6: Store Closures and Industrial Silence. The contraction of Thom McAn did not unfold in a single dramatic announcement. It moved in phases. In the early 1990s, as sourcing shifted further overseas and mall traffic patterns began to fragment, underperforming locations were quietly closed. Leases were allowed to expire without renewal. Some stores were consolidated into nearby malls. By the mid-1990s, following Melville's decision to divest its footwear operations, the pace accelerated. Corporate restructuring translated into measurable retail contraction. By the late 1990s, the national footprint that had once exceeded 1,400 stores had thinned dramatically, reduced to a fraction of its former scale. There was no national liquidation spectacle. There were simply fewer Thom McAn signs each year. The retail retreat mirrored what had already occurred on factory floors. Between 1970 and 2000, employment in U.S. footwear manufacturing declined by more than 80%, according to federal labor data. Production that had once peaked at 640 million pairs in 1962 shrank to a small remnant of domestic consumption by the end of the century. Entire regional clusters contracted. New England, once synonymous with American shoemaking, experienced successive waves of plant closures throughout the 1970s and 1980s. In towns like Brockton, Massachusetts, historically known as a shoe manufacturing center, factories that had operated for generations either consolidated or shut down entirely. Brick mill buildings that once housed cutting rooms and stitching lines were converted into storage facilities, small industrial units, or office lofts. Some structures were demolished when redevelopment proved more economically viable than preservation. Municipal records from the period reflect shrinking industrial tax bases and zoning reclassifications. The physical landscape changed gradually, building by building. For workers, the experience was procedural rather than theatrical. Consider the final months of a mid-sized plant in New England in the late 1980s. Orders had been declining for years. Shifts were reduced from 3 to 2, then to 1. A foreman who had started in the 1960s as a stitcher now spent more time reviewing production targets than meeting them. Notices were posted on bulletin boards detailing schedule changes and revised benefit information. When closure became inevitable, severance packages were calculated according to tenure and union agreements. Pensions were addressed through negotiated settlements. There were no cameras. There were final paychecks. On the last day of operation, machines were powered down in sequence. Cutting dies were stacked. Partially assembled shoes remained on conveyor racks. Workers cleared personal lockers. For many, the transition was not to another footwear plant, there were few left, but to retraining programs, early retirement, or employment in unrelated sectors. The skills honed over decades, precise stitching, leather grading, sole bonding, had limited portability outside the shrinking industry. The retail side absorbed its own version of that silence. During the early 1990s, mall directories still listed Thom McAn, alongside department stores and specialty chains. By the mid-1990s, some of those listings disappeared. In certain shopping centers, the former Thom McAn location was replaced by a specialty athletic retailer or a discount apparel outlet. In others, the space was temporarily vacant, papered over with generic leasing signs before a new tenant was secured. The closure waves followed the logic of corporate restructuring. Early 1990s, selective store reductions tied to performance metrics. Mid-1990s, accelerated divestiture after Melville announced separation of its footwear operations. Late 1990s, residual contraction as the brand's national integration dissolved, and licensing arrangements replaced company-owned retail. Meanwhile, the broader American footwear market continued shifting toward imports and athletic specialization. Retailers recalibrated floor space based on category performance. Thom McAn's mid-priced leather positioning faced narrowing demand. As leases ended, capital was rarely reinvested at scale to modernize or reposition the brand. The contraction was incremental but directional. In some former factory towns, the physical remnants of the industry remain visible. Converted mill buildings in parts of Massachusetts now house mixed-use developments or light industrial tenants unrelated to footwear. In portions of the Midwest, former shoe plants were repurposed as distribution warehouses, ironically serving the logistics networks that now moved imported goods rather than domestically produced inventory. The infrastructure adapted, but its original function did not return. What distinguishes Thom McAn's decline is the absence of spectacle. There was no singular bankruptcy filing that defined the end, no dramatic public collapse that captured national attention. Instead, the process resembled attrition: fewer stores, fewer plants, fewer workers. Industrial noise faded into industrial quiet. Mall corridors adjusted to new tenant mixes. Former stitchers retrained or retired. Corporate reports described portfolio realignment rather than collapse. From the outside, the disappearance could seem gradual enough to go unnoticed, but measured across 3 decades, the contraction was comprehensive. A retail chain that once covered the country receded into fragments. A manufacturing base that once supplied hundreds of millions of pairs annually became a statistical minority. There was no single day when Thom McAn ended. There were only closing times, repeated across towns and years, until the network was gone. Chapter 7: Afterlife, Licensing, Fragmentation, and Memory. When Thom McAn disappeared from American malls in the 1990s, it did not cease to exist. It changed form. Following Melville Corporation's mid-1990s restructuring and its decision to separate footwear operations from the expanding CVS division, the Thom McAn brand was divested along with other shoe assets. The integrated retail chain that once operated more than 1,400 stores was dismantled. Company-owned locations closed or were transferred. What remained was the trademark itself, an intellectual property asset detached from the vertically coordinated system that had defined its golden era. In the years that followed, ownership of the Thom McAn name passed through corporate transactions tied to footwear holding groups and brand management firms. Rather than rebuilding a national chain, new stewards of the brand adopted a licensing model. The strategy was straightforward: monetize recognition without bearing the fixed costs of operating hundreds of storefronts. Manufacturers and regional distributors could license the Thom McAn name for use on specific product lines, paying royalties while handling sourcing and distribution independently. In the United States, Thom McAn gradually reappeared as a private label or secondary brand sold through other retailers rather than through dedicated Thom McAn stores. The name surfaced on selected men's and casual footwear collections, often positioned as affordable, practical options within multi-brand environments. The controlled retail system of the mid-20th century was gone. In its place stood a modular branding arrangement. Internationally, the trajectory differed. Licensing agreements enabled Thom McAn to operate as a standalone brand in certain overseas markets, particularly in parts of Latin America and Asia. In these regions, local operators used the brand's American heritage positioning to market footwear collections adapted to regional tastes. Storefronts carrying the Thom McAn name continued to operate abroad even as the U.S. retail footprint dissolved. The brand survived not through reintegration into a national system, but through geographic fragmentation. This afterlife reflects a broader pattern in late 20th century retail. Brand equity can outlive industrial infrastructure. A trademark can circulate independently of the factories and distribution networks that once sustained it. Thom McAn's identity, constructed in 1922 as a retail instrument, proved portable even after its original ecosystem collapsed. Meanwhile, its former parent corporation moved decisively in another direction. After completing the separation of footwear operations, Melville Corporation formally adopted the CVS name, consolidating its focus on pharmacy and healthcare retail. Over the next 2 decades, CVS expanded aggressively through acquisitions and organic growth. Store counts climbed into the thousands. Revenues reached tens of billions and later hundreds of billions of dollars annually. The company evolved into CVS Health, positioning itself as a vertically integrated healthcare enterprise encompassing pharmacies, benefits management, and clinical services. The divergence is stark but instructive. The corporation that once built a national footwear empire did not decline with it. It reallocated capital toward a sector characterized by recurring demand and demographic tailwinds. The footwear brand that had anchored its identity for decades became a licensing asset, while healthcare became the core growth engine. For Thom McAn, this meant continuity without centrality. The name persisted, but the national retail network that once gave it scale did not return. The brand's American footprint shifted from storefronts to product labels embedded within other retail formats. Internationally, it adapted to local ownership structures and market conditions. Memory now carries much of the brand's weight in the United States. For consumers who encountered Thom McAn during its peak, the name evokes mall corridors and predictable leather styles. For younger generations, it is less a retail landmark than a label among many. Without a unified domestic store presence, the brand's historical scale is not immediately visible. The afterlife of Thom McAn is therefore neither revival nor extinction. It is fragmentation, sold, licensed, repositioned. The name circulates, while the integrated industrial system that once sustained it remains a matter of record rather than operation. Chapter 8. What Thom McAn represents. Thom McAn's story is not exceptional because it failed. It is significant because it followed the dominant structural arc of late 20th century American industry. Its rise coincided with the peak of domestic manufacturing. Its expansion depended on a tightly aligned system of factories, distribution hubs, and mall storefronts operating within one national economy. Its decline unfolded when that alignment fractured. The essential mechanism can be stated plainly. Retail kept the customer. Manufacturing lost the economics. During the mid-20th century, American footwear operated as an integrated loop. Domestic factories produced at scale. Retail chains distributed predictably. Consumers purchased within a system that was geographically compact and economically synchronized. Tom McAn did not need spectacle or technological differentiation because the structure itself favored stability. The distance between production and purchase was short, and the cost structure was broadly shared across competitors. Globalization altered that equation. As overseas factories demonstrated that comparable products could be manufactured at significantly lower labor costs, even after tariffs and freight, economic gravity shifted. Retailers retained direct access to consumers through storefronts and mall leases. Manufacturing, however, became portable. It moved to wherever production was cheapest and most scalable. This separation redefined power. Retail brands with customer visibility could survive by adjusting sourcing strategies. Domestic factories, burdened by higher wages and legacy costs, could not compete on price alone. When the industrial base contracted, the storefront remained. Thom McAn adapted to global sourcing, as most retailers did. But adaptation did not restore its former structural advantage. The mid-priced leather category that had sustained its growth lost relative market share to athletic footwear and specialty retail formats. Cultural demand reallocated alongside production. The company faced a dual shift, economic and behavioral. Corporate transformation accelerated the outcome. When Melville Corporation redirected capital toward pharmacy retail and ultimately rebranded as CVS, it signaled a prioritization of recurring healthcare demand over discretionary footwear sales. In capital markets, healthcare offered steadier returns. Footwear, particularly in the mid-market segment, offered tightening margins and limited growth. Investment followed projected stability. Thom McAn was not undone by scandal, fraud, or catastrophic mismanagement. It was overtaken by structural realignment across three domains: global labor economics, shifting consumer preferences, and corporate capital allocation. Each decision along the way, outsourcing production, reallocating retail space, divesting non-core assets, was rational within its immediate context. Collectively, they dismantled a national chain. The brand's disappearance from American malls did not require a dramatic bankruptcy to be decisive. It required only the gradual withdrawal of industrial support and strategic emphasis. Factories closed as imports rose. Stores closed as portfolio focus shifted. The trademarks survived, licensed, and repositioned. But the integrated system that once linked American factories to American storefronts dissolved. What Thom McAn represents is not nostalgia for a vanished mall tenant. It represents a moment when American retail and American manufacturing moved in tandem, and the consequences when they no longer did. It illustrates how mid-market industrial brands, built for stability rather than reinvention, can be rendered obsolete, not by incompetence, but by systemic change. Scale alone does not guarantee permanence. Alignment does. Thom McAn was not destroyed by scandal. It was made obsolete by structural change